This is Season 5, Chapter 5 of The Tree of Life. In this episode, we will be returning the discussion to the podcast, Telescopic World, Season 4, Chapter 4. In that episode, we distinguished between path multiplicity and path parsimony. In that, path multiplicity was described as permitting nonlinearity, whilst path parsimony was the linear path corresponding to the conjoined consensuality. To start off, in the past episode and Season 4, Chapter 8, we talked about how there are two distinct equilibriums corresponding to nonlinearity versus linearity. In that episode, we did not distinguish linearity by whether it fit the conjoined consensuality or not, i.e., involved dissonant consensualities. In this episode, I would like to distinguish the linear equilibrium by whether it involves dissonant consensualities or not. Path parsimony was described as the linear path through the system which accords with the simplest linear path. In that path, substitution events, namely body switching or archetypal convergence, were the result of path convolution further to maintaining emotional continuity for expression. In other words, archetypal convergence enabled emotional fulfillment further to appropriation. Thus, in the example given, two individuals, both in love with the same person, one of whom appropriates the passion corresponding to that person in the acquisition of the object of affection from the other. That is to say, there is some element of substitution, or body switching, as well as archetypal convergence underlying the passionate experiences, which follow the acquisition of the object of affection. Now, archetypal convergence is not a linear phenomenon. In fact, in the last episode, we talked about an example of convergence which manifests as lateral action, as between a nonlinear and a linear actor. That is to say, that archetypal convergence as a phenomenon is a reflection of path convergence, which may or may not be linear. But it can also be said that archetypal convergence facilitates emotional continuity in linearity through path parsimony. But within nonlinearity, it facilitates epigenetic convergence between distinct paths resulting in lateral action. In other words, path jumping between two seemingly linear paths is a product of the same mechanism of archetypal convergence, producing epigenetic convergence between distinct system members. Now, it can also be seen that path convolution, that is non-parsimony, can also result from dissonant spaces. Which is to say, that in negation, in rejection of an affirmatory narrative, the continuity established by the path is spatial as opposed to emotional. This means that individuals who exist within dissonant spaces are prioritizing spatial attributes of continuity, as opposed to emotional continuity. Likewise, even in this form of path convolution, the result remains substitution events, body switching, further to maintaining spatial continuity within a linear path through the system. Now, since we can see that in the last episode, a common trait representation is necessary to produce archetypal convergence, that is, lateral action joining through epigenetic convergence, an actor within nonlinearity and one within linearity. It makes sense that this requires some common use of language to actualize specific impulses, further to the reciprocation process. This makes sense since we saw that there is no true distinction between internality and externality relationally, cognizant of the 9 dialogues of expression, and also we saw that rationalization is a group process, as opposed to an individual one. Thus, in our example of the two individuals in adjoining rooms, we can see that the process of lateral action, or the joining of two paths, one nonlinear and one linear, the step prior to genetic synchronicity, is the manufacture of a structure of rationalization, or language out of the reciprocation. So, for example, if person A shouts and person B reciprocates in the next room by shouting, the process is not complete until the two separated individuals manage to construct a language, or way to communicate intelligibly out of their murmurs. To conclude then, we can see that the process of path jumping, or joining of a nonlinear and linear path requires 3 steps. First, it requires reciprocation generating epigenetic convergence. 2, it requires language producing standardization of common trait representation. Third, it produces or requires genetic synchronicity between two segregated individuals. These three steps produce archetypal convergence, which permits lateral action within nonlinearity, or path convolution within linearity. That's the end of the podcast for today.